Hey everyone, did you know that Canadians have always been known for their love of traveling the world, exploring different cultures and beautiful landscapes? But in 2025 things seem a bit different. The world situation has changed, with political tensions making some countries less welcoming to Canadian tourists. From diplomatic troubles, security risks, to cultural clashes, all sorts of things. In this video I'll analyze why these countries are difficult for Canadians to visit. First I want to talk about Saudi Arabia, a place that many Canadians probably thought, oh, let's go there sometime, I hear it's beautiful. But now it's a bit difficult. It all started back in 2018, when Canada and Saudi Arabia had a big argument about human rights. Specifically, Canada criticized Saudi Arabia for how they treated human rights activists like, hey, that's not okay. The result? Saudi Arabia got angry, cut diplomatic ties, expelled the Canadian ambassador, and even banned direct flights. Since then, the relationship between the two countries has been tense, and by 2025, it hasn't gotten much better. So, what if you want to go to Saudi Arabia now? First, there's the visa. It's a nightmare. Their visa application process is incredibly complicated, like you have to fill out a ton of paperwork, prove you have a lot of money in your bank account, and then get checked back and forth for all sorts of things. And it's not like you just submit it and get approved. They scrutinize everything carefully, especially if you've ever spoken out about politics or human rights. Some people have said they waited for months, and in the end, they were rejected without even knowing why. Basically, getting into Saudi Arabia now isn't just about having money and a passport, you also need luck. And then there's the human rights issue. This is important. Saudi Arabia has some laws that are a bit uncomfortable for Canadians. For example, if you go there and dress too casually, like wearing a tank top and shorts, you could get fined. Women have to dress modestly, they can't show any skin, like they have to be covered from head to toe. And public displays of affection, like holding hands with your lover on the street or kissing in public, forget it, there's a high risk of being questioned by the police. But the scariest thing is political speech. Let's say you accidentally post a status on social media like, the Saudi government is doing this wrong. Then you're in trouble. You might even get arrested. I've heard of cases where foreign tourists were arrested for accidentally commenting on something sensitive, and they spent several days in jail before being released. Basically, going to Saudi Arabia now isn't just about having fun, but also about being careful every step of the way. I think for Canadians who are used to freedom and like to live comfortably, these laws are a bit hard to swallow. Not to mention the relationship between the two countries hasn't improved, so it feels like Saudi Arabia isn't very welcoming. If you want to go, you have to be mentally prepared, otherwise a fun trip can turn into a stressful one. Next is Iran. This one is a long-running drama with Canada. The relationship between the two countries started to deteriorate in 2012, when Canada closed its embassy in Tehran like, that's it, we're not friends anymore, and then cut off diplomatic relations. But the climax was the PS-752 plane crash in 2020, when Iran mistakenly shot down a plane full of Iranian Canadians returning home to visit their families. As a result, more than 100 Canadians died, leaving the entire country shocked and incredibly angry. Since then, Canada has considered Iran a sworn enemy, and Iran doesn't like Canada either. In 2025, the situation is still very tense, with no signs that either side wants to make peace. So, what about going to Iran? Difficult, incredibly difficult. First of all, Canada doesn't have an embassy in Iran, so if you want to apply for a visa, you have to go through a third country, usually Turkey or a neighboring country, to submit your application. And the procedures, oh my, mountains of paperwork, you have to prove everything, and then there's an interview. Some people say they waited 3 to 4 months and were eventually rejected without knowing why. The visa approval rate is very low, especially if you are Iranian Canadian or have participated in protests against the Iranian government, then you have almost no chance. And then there are the laws in Iran. They're chilling. You can't drink alcohol there, it's strictly forbidden, and anyone who violates this law goes straight to jail. Women are required to wear a hijab. If they don't, they'll be arrested immediately, no negotiation. But the scariest thing is that they also check your phone. Let's say you accidentally have sensitive photos or messages on your phone, like anti-government stuff or something, and they find out you're done for, you'll definitely be detained. Some people have said that their phones were thoroughly searched, every photo, every chat was checked. It felt like they had no privacy at all. For Canadians, these things are a bit too much to bear. In Canada, we're used to freedom, we can say what we want, wear what we want. Going to Iran is like stepping into a completely different world. Not to mention if something happens like getting arrested or getting into trouble, there's no Canadian embassy to ask for help. You can only rely on other countries, and it's not certain they'll be eager to help. Basically, going to Iran now is like gambling, and the odds are stacked against you. Let's talk about Egypt. This is also a hot topic with Canada. Egypt is famous for its pyramids, the Nile River. Sounds fascinating, right? But traveling there now isn't as simple as it used to be. Canada has criticized Egypt quite a bit about human rights, like, you're arresting innocent people, treating them badly. Egypt doesn't like being told that, so the relationship between the two countries has become increasingly strained. By 2025, although diplomatic ties haven't been completely severed, it's clear that Egypt is no longer as friendly to Canadian tourists as it once was. Want to go to Egypt? A visa is the first problem. They require you to prove your finances, to have enough money in your account so they know you won't be a freeloader there. And if you're a journalist or activist, like someone who has written articles or participated in protests, getting a visa is even harder. Some people have said they were repeatedly questioned during their visa interviews like, "What are you doing here? Are you planning to write anything?" In the end, many people are rejected outright. And then there's the matter of being there. Egyptian law isn't easy to deal with either. They are very sensitive about political issues. Let's say you accidentally post a tweet like, "The Egyptian government is strange." Then watch out, you risk being arrested immediately. Freedom of speech is very limited here. It's not like Canada where you can say whatever you want. There have been cases of foreign tourists being arrested for taking pictures in sensitive areas or commenting on the government, and then being detained for several days before being released. For Canadians who are used to living freely, these things can be a bit suffocating. Not to mention, Egypt isn't very safe now either. Street crime, tourist scams are also common, and if you get into trouble, support from Canada is difficult because the relationship between the two countries is not good. In short, going to Egypt now is not just about money or time, but also about accepting risks. If you like adventure, give it a try, otherwise think carefully. Finally in this section is India, a place Canadians used to love to visit because of the delicious food, unique culture, and enchanting scenery. But by 2025, things have changed, especially after the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. The story is that Nijjar, a Sikh leader in Canada, was assassinated, and Canada suspects India was behind it. Since then, the two countries have been arguing loudly, and the relationship has deteriorated significantly. India said it has nothing to do with us, while Canada insisted on investigating. As a result, going to India is now much more difficult than before. Applying for an Indian visa is a nightmare now. Normally the electronic visa, e-visa, is quick and easy, but it's not so easy for Canadians anymore. Applications are scrutinized more closely, waiting times are longer, sometimes even months, and the rejection rate is also high. Especially if you are Sikh or have spoken out against the Indian government, it's pretty much game over. Someone said they submitted their application, waited and waited for a response, and only found out they were rejected because they had participated in a protest in Canada. In general, India is very sensitive now. They don't like anyone touching their political affairs. And what about once you're there? You have to watch your mouth. Any statement related to politics like the Sikh separatist movement or criticizing the government can get you deported immediately. There have been cases of tourists being invited to the police station just for saying something during an argument at a cafe. And the laws in India are also complex. Sometimes you don't know you've broken them until you're punished. For Canadians who are used to freedom and speaking their minds, these things are a bit difficult to adapt to. Not to mention, relations between the two countries are bad, so consular support is also limited. If something happens, like losing your passport or getting arrested, don't expect too much from the Canadian embassy because it's difficult for them to work with the Indian government. In general, going to India is no longer a fun trip where you just grab your backpack and go, but you have to plan carefully, or you'll bring trouble upon yourself. Now, let's move on to Venezuela, a place that, frankly, is probably only for the super brave these days. Venezuela and Canada used to have normal relations, but things took a turn for the worse around 2020. Canada closed its embassy in Caracas like, okay, we're done here, because the political situation there was chaotic. Plus, Canada supported international sanctions against the Venezuelan government. By 2025, relations between the two countries hadn't improved, and the situation within Venezuela was getting worse. Instability, poverty, crime everywhere, All in all, going there now is a real challenge. If you want to go to Venezuela, first there's the visa, which is a nightmare. Because there's no Canadian embassy there, you have to apply for a visa through a third country, and the procedures are lengthy, the paperwork is piled high, and waiting for months is normal. But the problem is that the rejection rate is very high, especially if they suspect you're going there to do something not transparent, like a journalist or activist. Some people say they submitted their application, waited forever without a response, and when they asked, they were told, "Your application doesn't meet the requirements," without any further explanation. In short, getting a visa to Venezuela now requires not only patience but also luck. So, let's say you get through. Oh boy, brace yourself. Venezuela is incredibly unstable now, and crime is everywhere. Walking the streets of Caracas at night means you might get robbed. Some people say they were stripped of everything as soon as they got off the plane, from their phone to their wallet. Then there's the shortage. Food is scarce, supermarkets are empty, and if you want to buy anything you have to stand in long lines or pay black market prices. The electricity cuts out constantly, sometimes for the whole day. If the hotel doesn't have a generator, you're sleeping in the dark. For Canadians used to living comfortably with amenities, this is hard to swallow. And if you run into trouble, like losing your passport or getting arrested, you're on your own. There's no consular support, and the Venezuelan authorities aren't friendly to Canadians. There have been cases of tourists being arrested for taking photos in sensitive areas, spending days in jail before being released, with no one to help. In short, going to Venezuela now is like jumping into a game where the odds of losing are 90%. If you like adventure, go for it, but I recommend saving your money and going somewhere else. Next up is Turkey, a place that Canadians used to love to visit because it has beautiful beaches, unique culture, and delicious food. But by 2025, things aren't so simple anymore. Canada-Turkey relations started to strain a few years ago, mainly because Canada criticized Turkey for its human rights record and its treatment of minorities, especially the Kurds. Turkey doesn't like being lectured like that, so the two sides have been exchanging words with no one willing to give in. Although they haven't completely severed relations, it's clear that Canadians are no longer welcomed as warmly as before. So, what's it like to go to Turkey? You can still get a visa, but it's not as easy as it used to be. They check very carefully, especially if you've said anything touchy about the Turkish government on social media. Some people say they were denied a visa just for posting an article supporting the Kurds a few years ago, like, there's a problem with your account, and that's it. And once you get there, you have to be careful about what you say and do. Turkey is under strict surveillance now, especially for foreign tourists. If you happen to post a status like the Erdogan government is so weird, watch out, you might get invited to the police station right away. The laws there aren't easy to live with either. Protests are absolutely forbidden, and Canadians are sometimes used to freedom, wanting to speak out when they see something unfair. But forget about that in Turkey. Participating in protests or taking photos in sensitive areas will get you arrested immediately. There are also restrictions on freedom of speech. Social media is tightly controlled, and if you want to say anything sensitive on Twitter or Facebook, you might get blocked. For Canadians who are used to living comfortably and expressing their opinions, this is a bit suffocating. Moreover, if you run into trouble, support from the Canadian embassy isn't very strong because relations between the two countries are strained. In short, going to Turkey now isn't just a vacation. You have to walk lightly and speak softly, or you'll get into trouble. If you want to try it, be prepared.
Getting to Russia, everyone probably guesses it's difficult now, right? Canada-Russia relations started going downhill when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and then got even worse with the war in Ukraine. Canada is one of the countries that strongly supports the sanctions against Russia, like, what you're doing is wrong, there must be consequences. Russia, of course, wasn't happy, and responded by making it harder for Canadians to enter. As of 2025, the relationship between the two countries is still icy, and the situation in Russia isn't very stable either, making travel even more difficult. If you want to go to Russia, a visa is the first hurdle. Getting a Russian visa wasn't easy before, and now it's even worse. Your application must be complete, with proof of funds and a clear itinerary, and they scrutinize everything very carefully. Some people say they applied, waited for a whole month, and were finally rejected for security reasons. It sounds vague, and there's no way to argue. Especially if you've ever participated in anti-Russia protests or posted anything anti-Putin online, you're pretty much out of luck. Basically, Russia isn't welcoming Canadians right now. If you want to get through, you have to have a spotless record. And what happens once you're there? Be careful, Russia has tight control. If you happen to say anything against the government like, Putin isn't doing a good job, you risk being monitored or even arrested. There have been cases of tourists being taken to the police station just for making a comment in a bar, and then being detained for a few days for questioning. The internet is heavily censored. If you want to access Google or Facebook, you have to use a VPN. But using a VPN isn't 100% safe either, because if you're caught, you could be fined. For Canadians used to free internet access, this is really frustrating. Not to mention, because of the poor relationship, if you run into trouble, the Canadian embassy in Russia can't do much to help. Someone said they lost their passport, contacted the embassy, and had to wait a whole week for assistance, because the Russian authorities weren't cooperative. Basically, going to Russia now is like walking into a trap. It's beautiful, sure, but the risks are everywhere. If you're a thrill seeker, go for it, but I'm a little hesitant. Finally, there's North Korea. I don't need to say much about this one. Everyone knows it's super difficult. Canada and North Korea have almost no diplomatic relations to speak of. There's no Canadian embassy in Pyongyang, and North Korea isn't exactly eager to welcome Canadians. As of 2025, the situation remains the same, even worse because North Korea is increasingly isolated from the world. Basically, if you want to go there, you really have to be a daredevil. What about a visa? You can't apply for a visa the usual way, you have to go through government-organized tours. Canada doesn't have an embassy there, so you have to contact a third country, usually China, to register for a tour. But the procedures are complicated, they do a thorough background check, and if you're Canadian, you'll be scrutinized even more. Someone said they submitted their application, waited for a whole month, and were finally rejected because they had worked for a non-governmental organization like, you don't meet the requirements. And that's it. And what if you do get there? Oh boy, the rules in North Korea are on a whole other level. You can't move around freely, there's always a tour guide with you, monitoring every step. You have to ask for permission to take photos, and in sensitive areas, like statues of leaders or military zones, it's strictly forbidden. There have been cases of tourists being arrested for accidentally taking pictures where they weren't allowed, and being detained for a whole week before being released. You also have to be careful about your behavior. You can't say anything that touches on the government or leaders, even if it's just a joke. It could be considered offensive. For Canadians, this is a bit much to handle. In Canada, we're used to freedom, doing whatever we want. Going to North Korea is like being caged. Not to mention, if you get into trouble, like getting arrested or losing something, there's no Canadian embassy to turn to for help. You can only rely on the country organizing the tour, and they're not even sure they can help. Basically, going to North Korea now is like playing a dangerous game. It's exciting, but the risks are sky high. So, yeah, in 2025, international travel for Canadians isn't as easy as it used to be. Political issues, diplomacy, and all sorts of regulations make things complicated. You have to think hard about where you're going. It's a real headache. So, if you're planning to pack your bags and go, remember to do your research, from the diplomatic situation to the country's visa policy. Otherwise, all your preparations will be wasted. I hope this video gives you a clearer picture. What do you think about these obstacles? Are there any countries you think are worth visiting despite the difficulties? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more helpful information. See you later. See you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more helpful information. See you later.